Well, it was bought to be a farm. My family, the Storck family, was a family of farmers. At some point they came from Germany. We're not entirely sure exactly when. They may have come from Holland before they came here. So none of the relatives that I've talked to seem to know exactly when the Storcks came over from Germany. All we know is that they bought this tract of land here at that time, approximately 1860. And they started immediately to farm. They grew wheat and oats and corn, and those were their big crops. That's what they had whole fields full of. Around the turn of the century, it was a very, very prosperous farm, because not only did they have the grain crops that I mentioned, there was livestock. There were many cows. We had a big cow barn. There's a cow yard back of where the barn used to be, and they also had horses. And I remember the last horse, who was very old when I was very young. And they had many cows, and they had chickens, many chickens for the eggs, obviously, and for the meat. And my father raised rabbits. He was a big rabbit breeder, and he used to sell the rabbits. He had over 100 at one time, I remember. And we also had pigs. Just north of the house here was the pigsty. I don't know a better name to call it, but that's what it was. But I don't remember that, because when my mother married my father, she told him she didn't eat pork. So my grandmother said to my father, "We're getting rid of the pigs." So the whole thing was gone. And many farmhouses the kitchen was, you can notice how big the kitchen is. The kitchen is big because it was the main used room of the house. It was a combination of what we have today as our den, or our living room and dining room. Part of the reason was there were big families. Part of the reason was that at the turn of the century, when he was very prosperous, he had hired men and hired women. And and they would all be fed. And my grandmother and her mother-in-law before her would cook a big meal, and at noontime the men would come in and they would eat, and then they would go back out to eat or to work until the work was done. And the work sometimes wasn't done until after dark. Sometimes it was very hard work, because they didn't have a lot of the modern equipment that we do now. When I was a kid, they had combines. They were these huge, they looked like giant insects. They looked like claws sticking out, but that was the chute, because one chute would shoot out the chaff. The other chute, or the other part, would bring the oats right into the bin. But in the old days, they used to have horse-drawn reapers, where it was the same idea, but the horse would pull it along the fields and bring the oats in, and then they would harvest it by hand. The main barn is fallen down, and that barn may have been there since 1860. It began gradually falling apart, probably went for good 10 years ago. The chicken house is still back there, I think, the ruins of it, the chickens that we had. It was my job to feed the chickens. And that was you had to feed them, and then you had to gather the eggs. And I always remember that, because sometimes the hens would be sitting on them and they wouldn't like it. So you go there and you start putting your hand under the chicken, and the hen would peck at your hand, and so it wasn't a fun job, but it was a job that was part of the farm work that my father expected us to do. In fact, one time after my mother and father were married, my mother woke up in the middle of the night and my father wasn't in bed. She got a little nervous. So she looked around and she saw a light out here in the brooder house, and she went out there and looked in the window, and there was my father sitting on the floor, and the little baby chicks were crawling they were climbing on his legs and on his back, And he just was loving it. He was just sitting there and watching them peck around, and they were only about that big, you know, and they were fuzzy. And my father had a real affinity for animals. He just loved animals of all kinds.